These are the moments that rippled out through the United States and stretched across the world in the spring of 2020. As I'm sure you vividly remember, it was what so many people felt was the only response to the murder of a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd. A police officer kneeled on his neck while he struggled to breathe. And he did this for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in front of a crowd of people who screamed and begged for him to stop. Before Floyd, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice in 2014, Walter Scott in 2015, Alton Sterling in 2016, Stephon Clark in 2018, Breonna Taylor in 2020. She was shot and killed by law enforcement in her own apartment. But Floyd's death was the breaking point and the spark to a movement to defund the police. A movement that spread to Canada as well, because that same year there was DeAndre Campbell, Ijaz Chowdhury, Regis Korchinski-Paquette in Ontario, Chantel Moore and Rodney Levi in New Brunswick, all killed by police. But 2.5 years later, what, if anything, has actually changed? Hey there, I'm Andrew Chang. Welcome to About That. When the defund movement hit its peak, there seemed to be so much momentum behind it. But it is astounding to see how dramatically that momentum has fallen off. The day after George Floyd dies in police custody, video of his violent arrest is shared widely on social media, causing mass protests to erupt in Minneapolis.
Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name!
Those protests spread to other American cities, including Memphis and LA. But even early, there was backlash. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz would call in the National Guard to respond to the protests. A day later, protesters carve a swath through New York City and Atlanta. It's around this time protests calling for police reform begin to ripple out in Canada as well. Across the country, people taking to the streets to speak out against racism and police brutality. And within cities across the U.S., real proposals to reduce police budgets. That momentum would find a national stage. A U.S. Senate bill on police reform is introduced. It proposes sweeping changes to policing, including deterring the police's use of force and holding officers more accountable. And those conversations begin in Canada, too. The Toronto Police Services Board passes 81 recommendations for police reform. But over the next year, momentum slows considerably across North America. By September, the U.S. Senate bill talks break down. The bill dies. And then 5 months later, President Joe Biden calls on states to use federal funds to hire more police officers.
We should all agree the answer is not to defund the police, it's to fund the police.
Fast forward to January of this year, the Toronto Police Services Board follows a similar line, approving a 4.3% increase of nearly $50 million to the city's police budget. But here's the thing, Toronto isn't the only Canadian city increasing its police budget. They're actually up right across the board. And in fact, we couldn't find a single police department in a major city that was defunding. They're all funding more, and in some places by record amounts. Montreal Police are seeing an unprecedented $63 million increase. That is an 8.7% rise. That's to their budget this year, smashing through the old record increase last year of $45 million. Ottawa's police force is seeking an additional $15 million for its budget. That's a 3.8% rise. Vancouver will vote on giving $38.5 million more to its police force. That's an 11% increase from last year. And Calgary approved a $34 million increase over the next 4 years. That's a 7.8% rise. Now, those are hefty increases, and it's what those increases pay for where things get a little tricky. Because when we talk about defunding the police, you know, it's not so much that we're talking about reducing how many guns they have or, you know, getting more vehicles. We're talking about reducing how many people they have. 90% of Toronto's police budget last year paid for its staff. So that's, salaries, overtime, benefits. for the roughly 5,000 uniformed officers and 2,400 civilian members. The point being that defunding the police means cutting jobs, which we know opens up a whole other can of worms no matter what field or industry you're talking about. Austin, Texas gives us a great example of this because not too long ago, it actually followed up on its promise to cut its policing budget.
The Austin City Council voted unanimously to immediately cut $23 million from APD's budget.
Austin is looking at massive, sweeping changes to policing. The goal is to keep people safe, and some say it's about time.
In August of 2020, Austin City Council voted to cut $150 million. That's a third of what it spends on policing each year. That's one of the biggest budget cuts in the entire country. Now, one big caveat here. Critics argue that the city actually only cut around 5% of the police budget because most of that $150 million was just sort of shuffled around to other departments. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So the 911 call center, it was just moved to another department outside of the police budget. But obviously they didn't dismantle the 911 service, right? Still, this does represent one of the most meaningful attempts to defund, maybe in the entire United States. So I spoke with NPR reporter Audrey McGlinchey, who's done quite a bit of digging on this story. Hey, Audrey, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Andrew?
Good. So help me to understand. I mean, like I get that the Austin Police Department, there's some creative budgeting involved, right? But when you set aside the stuff that, was just shuffled around, what was the meaningful change that actually happened?
The city just cut vacant police officer positions. So the city historically for a long time has had trouble hiring new police officers. And around this time in 2020, they had about 100 vacant positions. So they basically just said, we're not going to hold on to that money any longer, and we're going to reinvest it in other things.
But that doesn't sound like a very big change. I mean, unless the reinvestment in other things amounted to something. Like what happened on that front?
Yeah, so they spent this money on COVID response, for example. So EMS response to COVID. Remember, this was end of the summer 2020, so we were still deep in the pandemic. They also spent it on homelessness efforts.
And what would you say was the impact of that kind of a measure? Because that sounds like it's starting to approach what defund protesters were after, right? Addressing the kind of core structural systemic issues.
Yeah, at the time, a lot of the folks said this is a great start. We're like so excited to see this happening. Let's go further. Let's cut more money. Let's reinvest more money. Let's really reconsider how we want to police our people or what we consider to be public safety. Should we spend more money on housing or access to food or mental health? Maybe that'll make our city, quote unquote, safer. But then there was a big backlash almost immediately after this decision was made. And so folks, I think, didn't really get to see what this could have looked like.
So what do you mean when you say backlash? Like, what are we talking about there?
Right. So let's start with the police officers. Like, when I read exit interviews, so interviews of people who left the department around this time, a lot of officers were saying, because of this change, because of this vote by the city council to cut some of the funding for our department, we don't feel supported, we don't feel respected, we don't want to do this job here anymore.
We're losing 25 people a month now for the last couple of months, and normally we lose about 5 people. So that's a huge problem.
And then here in Austin, there was a movement too. Around this time, crime was going up, homicide particularly. We were seeing more homicides historically than we've seen in the city. This was happening in a lot of U.S. cities during the pandemic. And so folks were tying this decision to a rise in crime. It sort of stirred this big conversation in Austin about when we cut money to the police department, can that or does that have impacts on our public safety?
And did this groundswell of, I guess, opposition to the idea that police would be curtailing their budgets, did that lead to sort of bigger, consequences in terms of how all of this has unfolded?
Absolutely. So almost immediately, I think it was the same day after the city council here in Austin made that decision, the governor of Texas, Governor Greg Abbott, sent out an email saying, when the legislatures reconvene at the beginning of next year, we are going to pass a bill that prohibits cities from doing this again.
If we have lawlessness in our cities caused by local decision-making policies that reduce law enforcement officers, it's going to cause chaos throughout the entire community.
And they did exactly that. They passed a bill in 2021, which said any city that cuts money or doesn't fund its police department at the same level it did in the years past will not be able to raise certain property taxes. They won't be able to annex land, which has a lot of large financial implications for cities here in Texas.
Wow, so there is actually a built-in legal sort of financial disincentive for cities to do the kind of thing that Austin tried to do?
Absolutely, yeah. The legislature wasted no time in passing that bill to stop this from happening in other cities and to make Austin kind of correct in the eyes of state legislatures the mistake it had made.
So then what's the net outcome, Audrey? Like has policing fundamentally changed in Austin?
I'm not sure people would say it has. So following that bill, the city council refunded its police department. It actually passed the largest budget for its police department in its history. You know, there's still been some work on what the city has called reimagining public safety, thinking about how we want to be responding to 911 calls. For example, here in Austin, we were the first U.S. city to offer mental health as an option when you call 911. It still seems like police are still responding to many mental health calls. So it's really hard to say what impact, if at all, this has had.
And I guess, Audrey, this doesn't really sound like it resembles what defund protesters were after from the outset.
No, you know, when I talk to folks at this time who are pushing for these big budget cuts, they'll say to you, you know, a budget is a marker of a city's priorities. And our priorities are not in having this robust police force. Our priorities lie in things like housing, mental health resources, access, like I said, to food and medical care. And when the department we spend the most money on is the police department, that we're saying that's our priority.
Audrey, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, welcome back. I'm Lauren Bird. I'm a producer with About That. So I'm on my way into the offices of the Canadian Mental Health Association, where I'm going to talk to CEO Michael Anhorn and later one of the crisis support workers. They're running a pilot program that is allowing them to field some of the mental health calls that might have otherwise gone to the police. So let's go talk to them. So Michael, tell me, what do you do with TCCS? How does it work?
So we've got a mobile team that is made up of mental health professionals. There's 3 on every shift, and at least 2 people go out on every call. When a call comes into the team, they decide who's best to go out. They go out and meet the person in the community where they're at. They then work with the client to, as quickly as possible, understand what's causing the crisis, and not just the presenting issue of the crisis, but what's underneath it, so that they can support the person through the crisis.
Why is it important to have this kind of service?
So I think it's important for a few reasons. The first, which I always start with, is we know that people that are racialized are over-policed. And then if you add in an assumption or an indication that they might also have a mental illness, that then leads to even more over-policing. And so I think this is an opportunity to shift how we respond to people in our society. I think it's also an opportunity to say, when there's mental health crises, it should be mental health professionals that respond rather than police. Our team is trained in responding to mental illness and mental health crises, and the police have some training in that. But the reality is, if you come from a community where police aren't safe, then when the police attend, your stress and anxiety is naturally going to go up.
Right.
So even if they're really skilled at de-escalation, they're going to be de-escalating from a much higher place than when our team goes in, and our team is specifically trained in de-escalation. And so I think all of that comes together, getting the right kind of responder with the right kind of crisis, and working to change how we as a society interact with people that have been over-policed.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think you're going to take us to someone who's working on the response teams now.
Yeah, you're going to meet one of our staff who will be here very shortly to meet with you.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Dee Bramble, thanks for speaking with me.
No problem, anytime.
Walk me through what happens when a call comes in.
So we work collaboratively with the 911 and 211, and the call comes through, and normally what happens is the call basically tells us where the client is, if the client is urgent, if it's non-urgent, if it's a well-being check, if it's a person in crisis, or if it's someone that we have to basically get to urgently. So what we do normally is we accept or confirm the call. We get to the car, we have about 2 to 3, 4, 5 minutes to get to the car from the office, because usually it's urgent. And we basically get to the client's house, and we basically figure out if we want to assist with resources, assist with a conversation, assist with tools, assist with anything that could put the client at ease in the moment during that point of crisis.
And so what are the things that you're considering in those moments, getting into the vehicle and then also when you're there?
So assessment is one of them. Assessing risk, making sure that when we read the note that is sent from 211 and 911, it tells us if the Toronto Police is already on scene. It tells us if EMS is on scene or if fire is on scene. That way we can tell what we're kind of going up against when we get there. Usually when we get there, we're the first on scene because it's usually a mental health call.
So explain to me, how do you de-escalate a situation when you go into a place?
Because the team is multidisciplinary, you can have a peer support worker go into a situation, you can have a mental health specialist go into a situation. Because of our background, our education, we are able to assess a situation when we enter that door. Making sure that people know that we're there to listen and hear, but also letting them know that we're there to support them. Usually de-escalates a situation because we're not coming in with any preconceived notions. We're not judging. We just want to make sure that we get to a resolution that is supportive for the client.
And what are the kinds of questions you ask in that assessment?
We ask around how they're feeling in that moment, the reason for the phone call. Because a lot of times you can have a family member call, you can have a friend call, and the client may not feel the same way.
Right. So
a lot of times we try to get the outlook of things from the client's perspective and not anyone else.
So how does this compare to, a response before this program existed? Like what kind of, what would it have looked like maybe a year ago versus now?
We're doing everything we can to make sure the police is not involved. So if there's a call for where the Toronto Police may have attended first, now we go to these calls, and then based on safety, we may include the Toronto Police. If there's no safety concern, then we deal with those concerns.
What's a safety concern?
So it could be violence, it could be someone not being well, it could be someone we don't have any assessment around risk, so that way we need to make sure that we can support the client while being safe in that space.
Okay, so you would go in and just by what you see, you would sort of, if someone seems like they might be violent, that's when you would call the police?
Or usually what happens is there's an assessment done from 211 or 911, and they can tell us if TPS is on their way or they're already there.
Okay, so they make that judgment
Yes.
call often. Okay.
And sometimes we can also do that based on the assessment that our team does when we get there. If someone is not trained around mental health, different things can look different. So I may look aggressive if I'm just dealing with crisis. Imagine having a panic attack and someone doesn't know you're having a panic attack.
Right.
It could look like something else to someone else. So for us, we're all trained. We have a multidisciplinary team where there's a caseworker, there's a mental health specialist, there's an addiction specialist, there's a concurrent disorder specialist, there's peer support workers. We have all types of supports on the team that can assess situations when we go into them. That way we're well versed with what's happening in the moment. If we recognize that we do need police support, then we reach out to Toronto Police. If we don't, then we figure out how we're going to support that client while making sure the client is safe. At this point, it's all about client safety and making sure that people feel seen and heard without fear.
All right. Thank you, Dee Bramble.
Anytime.
So this is really fascinating. So Lauren Bird here to talk a little bit more about this. And I guess, like I didn't realize that this was a thing, that when a 911 call comes in, I guess there's a process through which that information gets filtered to this, Toronto Crisis Center. And that interconnectedness is really important, right? I mean, that's the whole pilot
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is. A call comes into 911 or 211, and 211 is a line you can call for community services or programs, social programs.
Here in Ontario.
Here in Ontario, yeah, exactly. So the call comes in, and those dispatchers decide whether this needs to go to the police or the ambulance or now the Toronto Community Crisis Service. So they will only attend if there isn't violence involved. So there's no weapons or an imminent suicide.
They're not police officers.
They're not police officers, exactly. And, one of the things that Michael Anhorn told me was that, over the years we've seen the police role expand because really they were one of the only services offered 24/7 for so long. So their role has expanded and expanded. And this is kind of coming in as a way to relieve that in a sense.
So what are the hard facts on this pilot project? Like how long have they been in operation? What does the funding picture look like? How many calls do they get in on a daily or weekly or yearly basis? What's that like?
So it launched in March of 2022, and it's funded by the city. So 11 million in the first year. This budget, the proposal is 13.7. So it's getting an increase, 25% potentially. So, but it is fielding a lot of calls in the first 6 months. So from the end of March to the end of September, it actually got about 2,500 calls total. And of those calls, and those were the calls that were coming in from 911 and 211, right? So so it's about 13 calls a day. So mobile crisis teams responded to 2,100 of those calls because sometimes on the phone they can deal with the issue there, right? And of the calls that came from 911, so 1,530 calls, 78% of those the crisis service was able to attend to without police involvement. So that's 1,200 calls where the police didn't need to be brought in.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so I guess, maybe even more importantly than the point of contact, there is follow-up, right?
Yeah.
This team is trying to establish something of a relationship with the people and incidents that it's responding to?
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's a big part of it, right? Like trying to get people connected to the services that they need. And ultimately, it's going to depend on what you're going through. So if you're having a crisis as a result of losing your job, then they're going to set you up with maybe some programs or training that might help you get back into the job market and get you settled back in there. So it depends what you're going through, but that was one of the examples that Michael gave me.
And that's something that a police officer would have a hard time doing, right?
Right. That follow-up just isn't built into the system that way.
Interesting stuff. Lauren Bird, thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Andrew.
And we will be back after this with a final thought. Hey there, welcome back to About That. So, during this episode, we've talked a little bit about, the waxing and waning of the defund protest movement over time. We looked at a case study from Austin, Texas about how whatever momentum they did have really collapsed on itself. And we've also showed you some of the smaller incremental changes that are happening, right? I mean, it's sort of a big deal to be able to divert emergency calls away from police to non-police teams. And it'll be really interesting to see how that pilot project continues to develop. But one thing we can't underline enough is just how political a conversation this really is, right? Like if only it were just a straight pragmatic conversation about, well, this proportion of emergency calls are really better suited to mental health professionals, and so let's just reallocate budgets and tactics accordingly. But, especially in the United States, the defund the police slogan has become sort of political kryptonite. And, when it comes down to it, when crime rates rise, who has the stomach to tell people that the solution is fewer officers? Really messy conversation and a tough one. Thanks for joining us here on the program. Take care.